Welcome to the Life of Christ, week 4 lesson. Today we're going to be talking about doing good on the Sabbath is not a sin. And this only applies to you if you believe the Sabbath should still be followed today, which I personally do not. But we're going to look at this anyways because it was important in the life of Christ, and it's important to know what exactly it was that he was teaching to his disciples and to other people around him, because we still have people who will hold to something like you can't do anything on Sunday. I mean, we live in West Michigan, so there are people who believe that you can't even wash your car on Sunday, you can't use a snowblower on Sunday, this, that, and the other thing. So this will kind of follow along with that, but it still has its own teaching from what Jesus was teaching his disciples and the scribes and the Pharisees that were always following around trying to get him on something. So let's dig right into it. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. Let us begin once I turn there. Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. We're already there. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. All right. At this time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read that David did what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread which was not lawful for them to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now when he had departed from there, he went to their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" That they might accuse him. And then he said to them, "What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And when he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other, then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. Really, you almost don't even have to go through any more of a lesson. You just need to read it and really read what it's saying, really just kind of observe what it's saying. And that's the whole point of what we do, is to try and get you to observe the text. But doing good on the Sabbath is not a sin. So let's look at this. Obviously, it's the Sabbath. They're walking through a grain field. What do you do when you're hungry? You're going to eat. And that's exactly what the disciples did. They said, "I'm hungry, I'm going to eat." And so these Pharisees said they're working on the Sabbath. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty ridiculous, that plucking some grain and eating it is work. I just don't see that as work. That's like picking an apple off of a tree to me. I don't consider that work. But it was considered work, and it was a big cultural no-no. And the Pharisees are nitpicking at every little thing Jesus does. This is their accusation. Your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Therefore, they are sinning. Jesus rebukes them. He asked them two questions that they could very easily answer, and because they were students of the Old Testament. And so he points them to these two biblical references, and you can find them in the Old Testament. Have you not read? And they knew the scriptures. Number one, what David did when he was hungry. He went into the temple and he ate what was only to be eaten by priests for nobody else. And he did it. And he lived. And it was on the Sabbath. So you've got David. And that has never happened since then, probably, and never happened before it. It's a big cultural no-no. Probably a very big religious no-no too. I mean, you just don't break into a temple and start eating their food. The second one, the priests profane the temple, and they're blameless because they're working on the Sabbath. So these are two big examples that the Pharisees are not following along with. Um, they do what is a big cultural no-no, what is a religious no-no, working on the Sabbath. Um, but he goes on into these next couple verses. Verse 6, he says that there's one greater here. In this field, there's one greater than the temple. And this was unthinkable to the ears of those religious leaders. Why? Because they couldn't accept that he was who he claimed to be. They couldn't accept it. They accepted the truths and history. Then you would think that this small infringement upon the law that these guys were breaking, the eating of the grain, the breaking of the law, you'd think they would be able to let that go. But they wouldn't, because they didn't like Jesus. And they did not want to accept that he was one greater than the temple. In verse 7, he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Basically, it goes like this. Their sin, these Pharisees' sin, was following their legalistic rules system that they had created on top of God's. They cared more about following their rules than the internal relationship God wishes to have with us, and it kept them from God. They wanted mercy and not sacrifice. They would have shown mercy and said, okay, you're hungry, obviously don't starve yourself to death. If you have to eat, go work and get your food. Go pick some grain, go get an apple. Do what you have to do. But they were more focused on the sacrifice that was needed to be given, which not doing anything was a sacrifice. I mean, let's just face it, not doing nothing can be really hard to do sometimes, especially when you want something. So the rules that they're following will never accomplish the relationship that God wants to have with them, and it will never accomplish the relationship that God wants to have with us. God would rather have us show mercy than to follow a rigid set of rules. I'm pretty sure we've all seen what happens when you follow a rigid set of rules. A lot of people get turned off. Some people love it because it gives them a nice little box or oval or whatever that they can live in, and they know that they're safe so long as they're inside that box. But you step outside that box, and then they're in big trouble. Some people like it, but it's not what God intended. He desires mercy and not sacrifice. So Jesus goes on to say in verse 8 that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Oh, that's another big slap in the face to the Pharisees. Not only did he call himself greater than the temple, he also called himself the Lord of the Sabbath. So he can do whatever he wants. It is truly his day. It is the day in which he rested after he created the world. In verses 9 and 10, there's a question asked. He goes into their synagogue, and these Pharisees ask him a question. What did they ask him? What did they ask him? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And it wasn't just a casual, teacher, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? I really want to know, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And depending on how you answer, we're either going to stick it to you or we're going to let you go. It was one of those kind of a questions. They're trying to back him into a corner. His responses is great. It just so happens to be that there's this withered man there, and it probably prompted the question. So what's Jesus do? Would you rescue a sheep if it fell into a pit? If it was strangling itself, would you not run and save it? Which is considered work, by the way. What would you do? What would you do? So, how much more valuable is man than a sheep? Jesus asks. Well, how much more valuable is a man than a sheep? There's a big difference there. So let that sink in for a minute. If you're having if you think that rules need to be followed all the time, just let that one sink in real quick. There's a big difference between a man and a sheep, and doing work to save one, but not the other. Here's the conclusion. It's not breaking the spirit of the law to do good on the Sabbath. To work just to work basically is what Jesus is saying. Okay, you need a day of rest. But to do good, that's a different story. It glorifies God, so it's exempt. The healing of this man, making somebody better than what they were before, is not breaking the Sabbath, is what Jesus is saying. And that's seen by the miracle that he does. This miracle for his withered hand, it was immediate, it was total, and it was lasting. It was just as healthy as his other hand, as almost nothing had ever even been wrong with it. You would think that the Pharisees would be like, oh, yeah, of course, why didn't we see that? But just like a lot of people, and you may become this way too, and I can become this way too, if we let rules guide us through our lives. We become angry at people who have the freedom to be able to do what they need to do in order to reach the world. Because what's that next verse say? What does verse 14 say? Let's read it. Verse 14. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. They hated him. But yet it is not wrong to do good on the Sabbath. That was the point Jesus tried to teach them. I'm sure his disciples got it. I'm sure the others in the temple got it. But these Pharisees, because he was sticking it to them, so to speak, he was correcting them, and they're the religious leaders. They are the ones in charge. They're angry at him. And they want to stick it to him. It became personal to them. So where do you stand on this? Are rules good? Rules are good. I won't deny it. Are rules meant to be followed all the time, in every situation, no matter what? That's up for you to decide. There are certain rules you don't break. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Don't cheat. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Those are ones you don't break. To do good on the Sabbath, that's one that you can do. Using a snowblower on a Sunday morning so you can get out of your driveway and go to church, I don't have a problem with that. Maybe you wash your car on Sunday. Great. Do it. Just don't do it just to spite people. Just remember, why are you doing what you're doing? And how will it affect somebody else? Will you be like the Pharisees, or will you be like Jesus?